first I should say that we had almost identical event yesterday in London. And since this is, one of my habits is not to give a lecture twice. I try to avoid it at any price. But since this is about the book, and it is literally predetermined, for those who were in my lecture yesterday, I give my apologies. It is pretty much the same lecture. Or you can leave if you wish. I would like you to stay home. I would like to begin first by outlining the major themes of the book for the benefit of those who have not read it. I will then move to a discussion of how this book fits into a larger project, a move that will itself be conducive to explaining the deeper structures of the present book. But I also will be talking about that larger project, which is the next book. I think the first thing to know about Restating Orientalism is that it is not really about Said's celebrated work. As I repeatedly stress in the book, I dwell mainly in the first chapter on his work because even after 40 years of its publication, it continues to represent the mainstream outlook on the problems it dealt with. In other words, I deal with Said because his work remains standard, but neither the work nor the author stands in any way as my terminus ad quem. The second point I wish to make is that the discourse on Orientalism is analogous to the discourse on the Holocaust and other genocides, with the crucial difference that this genocide discourse has been developed in promising directions and been given some depth and critical dimensions. Anyone familiar with the writings of critical theory circles with Hannah Arendt and several others will know that the Holocaust and all phenomena of the same species are not exceptions to the modern condition, but rather structurally integral to it, embedded in it, and the consequence of it. To study one such genocide is to study a building block in the house of modernity. One of the goals of Restating Orientalism is to embark on a similar exercise with the explicit purpose of showing that Orientalism is not just a field of specialization within academia that has been inflicted with certain epistemological problems. Nor do I think that uncovering traces of Orientalism or racist discourse in European literature does anything to enlighten us about the structures of thought that made Orientalism possible. I am, of course, here referring to Said's other work, Culture and Imperialism. What I propose in this book is that we should look much deeper than what Said has articulated and what the entire post-colonial discourse that his work has spun has managed to accomplish. I locate the problems of Orientalism in the deepest structures of Enlightenment thought, and in fact in the epistemological and ethical makeup of modernity as a whole. I locate it, to be blunt, in its effective anti-human and anti-natural proclivities. Said, the liberal and secular humanist, could not, I argue, transcend his own epistemological boundaries in order to subject the very liberal project as an Orientalist one. In brief, and capitalizing on a theory of paradigms I elaborated in The Impossible State, the book before Restating Orientalism, I argue that all academic disciplines of the central domains, including the range of scientific fields, engineering, business schools, economics, law, psychiatry, philosophy, history, and a host of others, are, as fields of discourse and knowledge, deeply and structurally implicated in Orientalism. Being themselves Orientalist, they are complicit in colonialism over man and nature. So here already you can begin to sense that my definition of colonialism is wider than the conventional one. All of this, I should say, comes to about half of the book's argument. The other half, spreading over 3 long chapters, deals with problems and issues that were not on Said's mind, and likewise continue to be largely absent from the discourse that his work generated. One such issue is that of sovereignty, which I often tie to conceptions of agency as they have come to inhabit so much of post-colonial discourse. I argue that because of the rise in the 17th and 18th centuries of a new conception of the human, we have consequently come to inhabit a being in the world that is dominated by an unprecedented concept of sovereignty. That is sovereignty over everything, an unqualified sovereignty over everything. While many of us may not dispute this phenomenon, I don't think that we have sufficiently teased out its implications. Foucault, for instance, understands the problem with a penetrating insight, but he never really cared about its destructive colonialist effects on man, on humans, all humans, and on nature. The sovereignty of the secular age, I argue, has not only been implicated in genocide in its widest definition, and has not been responsible only for the wiping out of all so-called traditional cultures, but also for colonizing the future. By implication, sovereignty in restating Orientalism emerges not only as the real God of gods, but as a bundle of criminal and psychotic world of behavior. To make my case, I take a fairly close look at the corporation, especially the multinational variety, as well as the Schmittian Agamben state of exception, to show that the distance between modern polity and criminality and destruction is not a big one at all. That's one important theme in the book. But there is yet another. I argue that Said was confused about the theory of the author, misunderstanding Foucault, who himself, I think, did not tease out the implications of the very idea he dabbled with. The book then can be said to begin an inquiry into a typology of the author that identifies a new subset of authors, namely the dissenting and subversive authors. These are my categories. This classification also ties to Kant's and Foucault's concepts of critique, which was not immediately relevant to me in the book, but one that will hopefully follow soon. The point is that the author as critic must be distinguished, because it is precisely here that the meaning of critique finds its most fertile grounds. And so I capitalize on the notion of critique in order to sort out the kind of authors who meet and do not meet the qualification of so-called bad Orientalist and good Orientalist. To do so, I bring in the French Orientalist René Guénon, who emerges as a subversive author, as compared to Said himself, who is merely a descending author, and who is totally absent, by the way, from Said's Orientalism. Said doesn't even mention his name once. I say merely about Said being merely a dissenting author, because Said and the entire discourse his work has generated in Western academia have not met the conditions of critique I mean here. But my use of Guénon has more to it than meets the eye. I attempt to show that one can be an Orientalist and still be a subversive critic, which is to say that even if I were to call for the abolishment of many academic fields of the central domain, some of which I named before, I would not call for the deletion of departments of Orientalism. You might be very happy to know. Whether they study China, India, Africa, or Islam, among others. And the reason for this is precisely that it is through Orientalism, among some secondary others, that a subversive critique can be conducted, as I show to have mostly done. Finally, in the last part of the book, and after having dwelled at length on the rise in modernity of the problem of knowledge and power, I deploy a critique of the modern subject, especially the liberal one, and propose, while engaging the present disciplines of Orientalism and history, that to exit our current modes of knowledge, the subject must be reconstituted. But I must say that the story of this reconstitution is not complete, at least not for the moment. I take up this project of reconstitution, the sequel, if you wish, the sequel to Restating Orientalism, in the last part of another book that should appear next year, likely under the title Reforming Modernity. There I dwell again on the concepts of sovereignty, materialism, gratitude, and humility to make my argument for a new concept of the human. So one thing I'm going to ask you to keep in mind, that anything I'm going to say after this point is in fact directly tied to Orientalism. So I'm not giving you now another lecture which does not tie to the book itself. It is in fact integral to this understanding, or integral to my critique. Building on the Moroccan moral philosopher Abdul Rahman Taha's theorization of the subject, I argue that we can indeed speak of particular qualities that characterize the new concept of the human. The characteristics that are necessary, which are also the minimal essentials that make such a new human, will require her to be who she will need to be. As an antidote to the modern malaise, each of these characteristics are deemed essential because each performs, along with others, a particular task, the totality of which make up the condition of a sufficient palliative. Note also the medical terms here. If essences are involved in this narrative, it is because the malaise dictates and requires them as a matter of necessity. Change the malaise and the essences will in turn change. Since the diagnostic, that is critique, undeniably operates within a specific and fairly well-determined etiology, we can then comfortably speak of a set of necessary characteristics. Now, taking for granted that every subject must be located within and formed by one type of technology of the self or another, one type of habitus or another, invoking Bourdieu and others, a new concept of the human will be said, in light of modernity's specific crisis, to enjoy a number of essential characteristics, all of which are interrelated and constitute a single interconnected whole. But please note that what I am about to say goes right to the heart of what may be cast as how not to be an Orientalist, or how not to be a bad Orientalist, at least, in the sense that has been inhabiting our academic terrains so far. In other words, to speak of the subject is to speak of the crisis of modern epistemology, including every academic disciplines, and of course, including Orientalism. Now, a point of entry to this interconnected whole I'm speaking of is the characteristic of anti-materialism, generally defined as a critical and systematic transgression against divination of the material world, where matter, including the human as materially conceived, has been endowed with the highest values. Materialism is therefore not just a physically disposed attitude to the world, but also, and in fact, a metaphysical conception of material reality as one of brute, inert, and stupid matter, to cite Robert Boyle's famous descriptors. These are his characterizations, not mine. This metaphysics also rests on a potent conception of instrumentalism that systematically makes a habit of confusing ends with means, converting the former into the latter and rendering the modern telos an unattainable desideratum. The anti-materialists, by contrast, recognize higher principles as ever binding, precisely because these principles are not subject to the discretion of the whim of materialism. This is not to say that material existence should not be abolished from the world, for the world is, after all, made of matter. But the world is obviously not just matter, and nor is it just the total sum of all of its parts. Whether at the spiritual metaphysical level or material physical plane, sentient and insentient life lives in and with matter. The anti-materialist, therefore, recognizes that in this complex existence, materialism is no more than a means to an end. And the two are neither twain, nor are they to be confused. Matter is always subservient, yet still integral to a higher order of existence that is made of first-order ethical principles. The new concept of the human must therefore presuppose a subjectivity that is characterized by a categorical absence and total negation in its very constitution of sovereignty, perhaps the most important theme in both restating Orientalism and reforming modernity. Yet this is not to suggest that sovereignty is substantively separable from materialism, for both go hand in hand. In fact, they are concomitants, since modern materialism presupposes and lives on sovereignty, which is to say that materialism is made ontologically possible by an unbounded form of sovereign epistemology. This is to say that the unbounded materialism of modernity and its subject must be seen as subordinate to sovereignty, for it was this latter, sovereignty, that gave rise to what has been called by many commentators, philosophers, thinkers, an innate love of mastery and control. If all this is anywhere near acceptable, then it is not sufficient for a new concept of the human to entertain or settle for the resisting subject, the subversive agent who refuses, quote unquote, who we are, what we are, as Foucault put it. To become performative, refusal must embody itself in a normative substrate, a substructure of thought, action, and feeling that systematically and systemically embed resistance and refusal in a habituated psychoepistemology of humility and modesty, all of which run against the core of Foucault's concept of resistance. Humility includes the concept and habituated feeling of gratitude, without which no modesty before or respect of anything is ever possible. Nor is there gratitude without humility, or humility without modesty. If the Foucauldian refusal and resistance are negative approaches, and they certainly are, then humility, modesty, and gratitude are the positive, non-defensive, and self-confident modi vivendi of being in this world. A new concept of the human thus generates a subject who does not recognize sovereignty and who cannot conceive of herself as being sovereign. Here, the Kantian trio of free rational will, by which I mean the specifically Kantian architecture of freedom, rationality, and willing, has no place in the architecture of the new subject, who perceives herself as devoid of the impulse to mastery and the quest for power. Yet to say, as I have done, that the new subject conceives herself to be devoid of this impulse is to overstate the point and misrepresent it. The new human would be intrinsically incapable of this mode of cognition. For to be able to conceptualize the meaning of sovereignty, mastery, or domination is to already be engaged with them in one way or another. To think them and to know them is to entertain their possibilities and potentialities. For it is true, I shall insist, that cognition is not only consciousness of the possible, but also an inroad to the performative. It is my argument then that resistance and refusal, a characteristic Foucauldian duo that follow on the heel of critique, are insufficient for producing the new concept of the human I'm trying to articulate here. What is needed instead is a new habitus, and more precisely, a new form of embodiment and ethical cultivation that permit no place either for the love of mastery and domination or for the very cognition of any forms of sovereignty. A new concept of the human thus demands a new forms of acculturation, education, and upbringing. The forms in this new configuration take it for granted that the subject is formed by humility, modesty, and gratitude, all of which are not mere nouns and derivative descriptors, but effectively performative as technologies of the self. They are not, in yet other words, just qualities that we may preach or admire, but they rather stand as constitutive of a world of values in which the subject is born and nurtured, systematically, systemically, and constitutionally. Humility is never timidity or meekness, nor is it submission or servility. It is, like modesty, a world in which pride and vanity have no central room for maneuver. If pride and vanity are human qualities, which they undoubtedly are, then they are to be suppressed and kept at bay, just as we in the modern condition abhor dishonesty, cunning, and the like. If modesty is unpretentiousness, moderation, and simplicity, then gratitude is appreciation, thankfulness, and a deep feeling of indebtedness. And all of these interconnected qualities make for a new habitus, a performative technology, and an uncompromised way of living in the world, not above it. They are in the world, in other words, not the stuff of theory and words, but rather of praxis. And I mean praxis, not practice. This is a systematic way of doing things that practice does not convey. Nor is living in the world not above it, just a virtuous quality that makes for a merely desirable way of experiencing the world. Living in the world, our fourth characteristic, is nothing short of a psychoepistemology dictating how one qualitatively lives and the full meaning of living in the world. A new concept of the human recognizes the world as a unity, where all things, sentient and insentient, stand in an interconnected whole. This is an inner, formative conception of reality, a view from within, an outlook integral to and internally embedded in a conception of the world as one formed by interconnections and continuity. To say that the world is continuous is to conceive of a fabric of being that makes everything one does, every omission and commission, relevant and thus effectual to everything else. It is also to say that because this living in the world is a psychoepistemology, continuousness and continuity are substantively made of an ethical fiber, endowed with an epistemology and ontology of responsibility and accountability. Whatever one does or says, or one does not do or say, has an effect on something ad seriatim around it, both conceptually and existentially. And if ethics is the way in which we speak of a genuine concept of responsibility, then everything that is said, done, or altogether omitted is inevitably engulfed and judged by this ethic. Responsibility then cannot be grounded in a rhetoric whose foundations are laid by anthropocentrism or secular humanism, for these have proven incapable of genuine solutions to many of the problems generated precisely because of them. This is partly the business of chapter 5, the last chapter in the book. The idea here is that the new human sees itself as standing in a series of equally created beings, all deserving of respect precisely due to the indomitable fact of equal createdness. Yet this equality is distinguishable, or must be distinguishable. The fact that the mare and its foal are equal members of the equidae never entails assigning them the same functions or responsibilities. Just as the mare is under the natural instinctive duty of caring and attending to its foal, the human is under the primordial obligation of universal stewardship. This is the natural lot and burden of humanity, just because it has been assigned in the nature of things to bear the unique weight of ethics. This is why Abdurrahman Taha, the Moroccan philosopher I mentioned, who's the subject of the second book, refuses the identification of the quiddity of humanity as a merely rational species, as, for example, Aristotle and the long tradition has done. For modern rationality, as a denuded and narrow form of reason, has proven capable of turning things into their opposites. If it is, after all, modern rationality that has justified and performed genocides, cultural and communal destruction, environmental destruction, and innumerable forms of atrocities and calamities. The concept of continuity and continuousness in the world thus demands bearing the burden of ethical responsibility of stewardship. But unlike Hans Jonas and his likes, who seem incapable of comprehending the depth of the status of equal createdness, we must not allow for this massively interconnected link to be missed. Humility and gratitude are not just states of consciousness. They are so crucial precisely because the human species is both burdened and privileged by the duty of trusteeship and stewardship, both of which translate into a care of the world. To be a steward is to live in a world that is psycho-epistemically saturated with humility and gratitude. It is to live in a world that does not, much less recognize, does not know, much less recognize mastery and love of domination, and in one word, sovereignty. This absence is in fact a productive presence, for there is no empty space or gap left by the unknowability of mastery. The space is rather an already full mental landscape that understands the necessity and implications of what it means to be a created thing. The very appreciation of the meaning of createdness, of man's contingency, ephemerality, fragility, death, and ultimate insignificance is precisely the necessary thick link that Jonas and others like him have overlooked. But as creatures of the secularized liberal habit, they have also missed the significance of praxis and psychoepistemology in ethical habituation, a lack that is also strikingly absent from Foucault, as well as Judith Butler and others. In fact, Foucault insists on it being absent. Jonas's concept of fear, that we will become good stewards of the earth out of fear that we will annihilate ourselves, for this concept of fear he is most well known. Jonas's concept of fear can never on its own accomplish much. It is for the most part unproductive. When the subject engages a praxis of ethical formation, she effectively engages a set of signifiers that bring together the communal and divine good as a unified world of reference. It is to understand the full meaning of the summum bonum, which is to say that the good is not a constrained notion of human welfare, but one that brings the individual, the community, and cosmology into one interconnected whole. I think it should be clear by now that the link between Orientalism and the crisis of modern knowledge are not just about how we represent others, and not about how we shouldn't be racist, how we shouldn't be arrogant or domineering. This is a relatively superficial stuff. This is what occupied Said. When we deal with Orientalism, we would be terribly amiss if we do not approach it as the distillation of the foundational crisis of modern knowledge, crises that call upon us to reassess the modern subject as the ultimate locus and seat of this knowledge. To study Orientalism is to study these crises as they inhabit virtually the entire range of academia. To study Orientalism, therefore, must ultimately drive us to find alternatives to who we are. It is in these alternatives that rest on praxis that we can resist. It is with these alternatives that a new system will emerge. Liberation does not come from a state or some political system. Liberation comes from the inside. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you for listening to my interjection, which I feel will only touch upon the merest elements of the book that Wael has offered to us to discuss today. Thank you very much to Humera Iqtadir and Amira Benison for organising the panel and inviting me to respond to Wael's book. And the perspective that I'm taking is very much informed by my engagement with, over more than 25 years, with and learning from Latin America, and particularly from low-income, racialized and excluded populations. and also informed by my disciplinary background, which is in geography and anthropology. So the book offers us a very rich and multi-layered set of arguments regarding the limitations of both the discussion of Orientalism that came out of Said's work, as well as other ways in which it has been framed as an issue subsequently. He makes a series of propositions regarding the dynamics between sovereignty, academic disciplines, and modernity. I would be calling it colonial modernity, but I think we are coming from very similar positions on this. And in this respect, the type of discussions that we're having in geography engage very much with the kinds of issues that Wael raises for us in his book, and particularly on the ways in which how we think of our speaking position with regards to knowledge production, and also how we think of ourselves in relation to histories of violence and damaging epistemologies. But my commentary and my questions arise from what we might call the friction between geography's current centering around grounded theory, that is, theory coming from grounded ethnographic and social science research, and its strong contextualization and the material embodied performativity of social life and political life on the one hand, and restating Orientalism's interest in, and here I use a geographical metaphor, mapping structures of thought. So in regards to that, I want to pick up on two aspects of Wael's book, namely distinction, which I will define in a minute for those of you who haven't read the book, and its related notion of sovereignty, and then secondly, the issue of agency. Wael suggests that the distinction, with a capital D, between nature and humanity underlies Western modalities of thought and its organization of knowledge and power, thereby constituting the basis for its violent expansionism. The distinction in this definition refers to the rise of the modern state on the one hand, and domination over nature, a theme which Wael has drawn out in his previous comments. He considers those to be the two necessary conditions that combine to create modernity. He outlines briefly, of much interest to myself, how a classical Islamic episteme viewed humanity and nature in very different ways, created by God, each created with equal intrinsic value and bounded by mutual ethics of care. And in contrast to that, Wael's book traces how the distinction placed Western humans as the ultimate arbiter, substituting secular sovereign power for an overarching deity, creating the basis for unrestrained and immoral principles and propulsions to the rest of the world. Domination over nature, if I understood his argument correctly, is the starting point for those political ramifications, in the sense that it is the thread that, if one pulls, unravels pre-modern modalities of politics and philosophies and creates instead epistemic sovereignty in the modern state, law, education, and the university. Although it is implicit, although rather than it directly stated, at least in my reading, restating Orientalism suggests that this distinction is now universal, in that it has become normalized and underpins the epistemologies of modern power and its avatars as a result of Western dominance. Jumping sideways into geography, there is considerable discussion of this distinction with regards to human domination over nature. And there is a move in the discipline to try and discuss what we call the more than human. And that refers to the agency, sentience, and significance of non-human forms which may be living in plants, animals, and so on, but also may include the physicality of mountains, bodies of water, bodies of ice, and so on. But the arguments in geography are very much informed by the notion that more than human is something which has to be argued for and demonstrated in the face of what Wael terms the distinction, because we assume that humans are over nature. The distinction perhaps suggests that there is and presumes a universal distinction between humans and nature, the Latourian notion of the ontological purification, for example. And this has, of course, created a need to examine precisely the kind of geographical language that goes into our very description of and understanding of and locating of that distinction. And here I draw on the work of Juanita Sundberg, who has written extensively about nature and gender and conservation in both the Central American context and in context of the trans-border migration of migrants into the deserts of southwestern United States. She and others have argued that it is not enough to take into account the more than human if we don't always take into account the way that the agency of those parts of the more than human operates. In other words, that we have to attribute agency which is differentiated and distributed to the components of the more than human, rather than attributing the more than human a sort of universal capacity to make its impact on the world. And the argument that she makes then is that much of the literature on the more than human tends to reinforce a colonial epistemology itself, because it assumes that the distinction between human and non-human is itself universal, which of course is universalizing a Western originating argument and episteme, but also that the ways in which we talk about it have to analytically become more nuanced in order to break up that universal geography. And I'll come back to an example a bit later on. But this leads me to my second response to the book and its discussion particularly of agency, especially those of colonized peoples and post-colonial subjects. Critiquing Homi Bhabha's work that posits a creative and adaptive response to Western power, Wael dismisses or argues that the distinction in its expression of sovereignty, that is the modern nation state and domination over nature, re-engineers the subject in a total way. He suggests that no modern subject can escape sovereignty. To be outside is to resist. And he argues further in a little bit later that there is no instance where non-European agency successfully rebuffed European colonists' assault. Agency then in this reading becomes something that occurs only within the terms of modernity, only once natives are, and I quote again, systematically and culturally converted, and it's too late to recover. In my last few moments, I'd like to slow down our thinking on this matter, querying whether there is the possibility of discerning some forms of agency within and around the distinction, and if so, ask what status it might have in our accounts of colonial modern power and knowledge. Speaking from Latin America, there is a growing body of ethnographic and social science work that evidences the durability, effectivity, and even political purchase of epistemologies that call a halt to or cross-cut the undoubtedly hegemonic and state-sanctioned routines of administration, exploitation of nature, business, and academia. To give one illustration from the area that I know best, for over 500 years in the Andes and Central America, diverse languages and achievements in law, medicine, astronomy, and political and civic authority, among others, have been reproduced, not under conditions of their own choosing, and continue to today. In other words, despite the education, law, and arbitrary force unleashed on the region, there has not been a totalizing remaking of subjects and mindsets in the name of modernity's sovereign. Against the theology of progress that posits a unidirectionality in history, for example, Andean subalterns articulate a circularity to time, process, and to knowledge. Yet neither is it the case that pristine, discrete epistemes exist as bubbles. In response, writers inside and outside universities have engaged with the question that was posed by Homi Bhabha, even if they don't follow his intellectual framework, and asked the question, how does one begin to label and to apprehend the kinds of distinctions, the kinds of sovereignty, and the kinds of knowledge that emerge and exist in this context? Hence, we may, just to drop in a few of the phrases that have been used in Latin America, we may talk of a pluriverse, of border knowledges, or of shikshi positionalities, drawing on Arturo Escobar, Walter Minolo, and Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, respectively. And how do we examine forms of power, disruption, and epistemic plurality in ways that acknowledge the arbitrariness and totalizing will to power of colonial modernity, because they are still undoubtedly there. So I approach these huge questions with a modest example of what we can call sumak kausai, or buen vivir, which are broadly translated from the Quechua and Spanish, respectively, as living well in harmony, and relate those to subaltern geographies in Ecuador. In 2008, Ecuador ratified a new constitution in which not only was nature that was named as Pachamama, which refers to the Quechua term for a sentient multiple agent corresponding to the earth, mountains, water sources, and other living things. Not only did Pachamama get awarded rights in its own right, but so too did political philosophy undergirding and informing the state's responsibility come from the idea of sumak kausai, which was a Quechua term which was translated then into buen vivir. And this form of political philosophy and action that through the Constitution was to become the responsibility of state action was a form of mutually constituting and ethical relations between humans and between humans and nature. How did these indigenous border knowledges gain the status of ratified law and procedure? The issue is too long to go into here, but effectively the political configurations that carried them through a process of political organization into the Constitution were sufficient to embed those principles at the heart of a modern nation state. Now we can certainly say and demonstrate this very clearly that that set of principles has not been able to withstand the onslaught of extraction and environmental degradation that the state has undertaken as a result of resource extractivism. But despite this, my ethnographic work in the Central Andes suggests that a specific articulation of a very specific set of facets of Pachamama have been in partial connection with indigenous subjects, indigenous subalterns, and that is used in order to retain and to build other forms of agency, even within this very complex and third space political context. And these subaltern geographies are constituted in relational dynamics with hegemonic power, yet derive their agency orthodoxy precisely from its disruption of the distinction, in both its human nature separation and in its sovereignty. In this case, could we perhaps say that Latour's stone, a metaphor Wael develops in a later chapter, bites back? To draw my comments to an end, I enjoyed the provocations of Wael's book and his ambitious project to restate Said, Foucault, and modernity, and to call to account all disciplines in addition to Orientalist studies in the modern academy. Speaking for my own disciplinary home, geography has much to account for still, not only with respect to its central role in colonization, but also in its pernicious effects in making the world more accessible to whiteness than to racialized subjects and spaces. So I have a series of short questions, which I don't mind if I raise, but I hope there are many other questions from the floor. I would like to ask Wael to elaborate on and how he sees alternatives to the distinction, where they are coming from. You just talked about this in the talk, perhaps, but you do mention in the book a revolution in chapter 4. Does this engage with the projects of decoloniality or decolonization that are present in Latin America and in South Africa, Britain, and the US? And
what do you mean by revolution? I'm not getting
the term revolution was used by you on page 196.
yeah,
but you were talking about, I don't have my notes here, but the idea of a revolution to overturn the forms of knowledge and power that you have described in the rest of the book. Yeah. And also, what role does that then leave for the university, and what role does that leave for relations that we might establish with actors and beings and agencies outside the university? How do feminist, indigenous, and participatory research and knowledge production projects outside the university offer another knowledge? And I'm thinking here of Bolivia's Colectivo Xixi, which is operating very much at the interface between universities and civil society.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming, first of all. I'd like to thank Amira for calling for this panel and for including me in it, and Amira for chairing it. And again, thank you for coming. Above all, I would like to thank Professor Hallaq for being here with us tonight, for sharing with us his thoughts about this important book, and of course for writing it in the first place. Now this is a profound, I prepared a couple of notes which have been already mentioned, but I think it is still worth repeating for those of you who obviously haven't read the book. It is a very significant book, and I have been saying to many of our students over the past few days that it is not every day or even every year that one comes across a book with such depth, erudition, perception, and moral rectitude. Both the scope of its analysis and the depth of its critique are phenomenal. And there is no doubt that Reinstating Orientalism will have a deep, and I hope, disquieting impact in many fields, primarily, but hopefully not only, Orientalism. A book as challenging and as disquieting as this naturally is bound to raise questions and stir controversies. At least I very much hope it does. And it is in the spirit of engaging critically with some of its central ideas that I have prepared these few words. But before delving into my critical remarks, and in the hope of enticing you to read the book and to engage with its important arguments, I thought it best to highlight one or two of its central arguments, as hopefully this may generate some questions among you in the audience. In a central manner, this book is a critique of Said's Orientalism, a book that was published exactly 40 years ago this year, and whose canonicity has been entrenched in the Western academy on both sides of the Atlantic. Hallaq's, of course, is not the first study to engage critically with Said's text, but I think it is fair to argue that never before has Orientalism, the book, been subjected to such an incisive analysis, nor its author subjected to such penetrating critique. Throughout reinstating Orientalism, Hallaq argues that Said's critique of Orientalism was deficient and, oddly enough, remained anchored and defined by a series of premises and assumptions that reinforce the very modernist and liberal positions that gave rise to Orientalism in the first place, is the quote. Said is criticizing for not, quote, delving deeper in his analysis of Orientalism than political relations and political strength, for suggesting that there was nothing specifically Western about the racism attending 19th century colonialism, and that all human societies, quote, at least the more advanced cultures, have rarely offered the individual anything but imperialism, unquote. For his inability to see the world outside liberal values, however critical of them he and other liberals are. For limiting his critique of Orientalism as a discourse to, quote, its malevolent representation of the Orient, unquote, and for missing out on the performative effect that Orientalism had on the Orient. One further aspect of Hallaq's critique is pointing out Said's, quote, total silence over the law, the single mechanism that made colonialism possible, unquote. Despite all of this is not a personal attack on Said, rather, or even his book, rather it is an impassioned plea to take Said's critique of Orientalism to its logical conclusion and to see what affinities Orientalism as a body of scholarship might have, not only with colonialism and imperialism, but also with genocide, with settler colonialism, secular humanism, anthropocentrism, Enlightenment rationalism, and liberalism, all of which rest on a mechanistic impulse and sovereign domination of the world. And it is this sovereign domination of the world which is based on what Hallaq calls the distinction, which we've already heard about, the capital D, distinction between fact and value, between is and ought, and which in turn has resulted in a deep and most alarming environmental crisis. It is this sovereignty that is the target of this incisive, passionate book. To explain how Hallaq moves from a critique of Said's less than useful, if not utterly useless, quote-unquote, study of Orientalism to this profound critique of sovereignty, it may be useful to stop at an important moment, historical moment, that of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. This, of course, is the famous expedition that is central for many studies of Orientalism, not least Said's, for the glaring way it combined military power with scientific knowledge. For accompanying the 60,000 strong army with which Napoleon invaded Egypt was an army of scholars, linguists, historians, cartographers, botanists, medics, physicists, chemists, and astronomers. It is these savants who ended up writing the multi-volume Description d'Egypte, an Orientalist text par excellence, and who ended up occupying a Mamluk palace in Cairo that had been abandoned by its former owner and converted into a scientific institute. The astute Egyptian chronicler, Abdurrahman al-Jabarti, visited this institute and had some remarkable words to say, words that Said studied, and it is Said's analysis that Hallaq found lacking. I'm not going to quote what Jabarti said because I presume you know them, because the important thing is what Hallaq, that's his gesture, that's his insightful gesture. Because what attracted Hallaq's attention is the fact that Said, when he comments on Jabarti's bafflement by Jabarti in his visit of the institute, the scientific institute, is that Said makes little of it. Quote, why Orientalism in the first place, asks Hallaq. And then he adds, but of course, this most obvious yet most profound question was not to be entertained by scientists, and nor could a whiff of it have been possible, because asking such a question would instantaneously lead to the next. Why anthropology? A close kin to Orientalism. Why sociology? Why economics? Why business and law schools? But then this line of questioning might become even more expensive and alarming if anthropology, sociology, economics, journalism, and the likes are included. Then why not only science or this deceptively innocuous history? Why did Western academia arise in the way it did in its entirety? This is what the book attempts to address, partly among many other things. So you thus have an inkling of the scope and the range of Hallaq's project. It is nothing that a probing, alarming analysis of modernity, it is nothing short than a probing, alarming analysis of modernity and its devastating impact on the world. At the core of his critique is firstly the rise of the modern state that has arisen from earlier crude forms under monarchical absolutism, especially under the Catholic Church, and secondly, a phenomenon referred to earlier, namely the distinction, that is the distinction between fact and value, which was expounded philosophically in the respective divorce between is and ought. And up against the unprecedented onslaught on the world in the name of enlightened rationality and sovereign domination, Hallaq makes a powerful plea to understand the Oriental cultures of pre-modernity in their organicist view of the world and the reflective ways of living in it. Cultures, he believes, which can provide heuristic sources of articulating new ways of thinking the world and living in it. These are deeply intriguing ideas, especially given that at the core they are informed by a deeply moral question. Quote, what kind of human being a scholar ought to be? Unquote. I want to end with raising two critical observations about these profound remarks, and I am sure the thought of them, and indeed there are already preemptive answers or responses to them in your book. Still, I would like to hear your thoughts on them. The first has to do with the nature of pre-modern power within Islam. I take seriously your remark on page 258 when you say reducing methodological concerns to the common modernist assumptions about, say, the role of the state in the management or control of sharia in, say, 14th century Cairo is not only a narrow and highly biased way of studying history, it also represents a distorted view of reality. Unquote. Be that as it may, I still want you to elaborate for us what precisely distinguishes modern from pre-modern forms of state power. I am convinced by your argument that there is something unique about the modern state, and I accept your incisive analysis of power knowledge in modernity. I also accept your critique of Said that he did not fully grasp Foucault's complex relationship between knowledge and power. But beyond the paradigmatic analysis, I wonder if you can refer to a specific Islamic state in a particular moment of Islamic history that illustrates your argument. What I find intriguing in your analysis is that it is missing references to specific moments in history that could illustrate your point about this state of affairs in which fact was not yet divorced from value, and the is was not yet separated from ought. I found fascinating your probing analysis of three instances of the distortions brought about by colonialism and Orientalism to sharia, specifically French Algeria, British India, and Dutch Indonesia. Amazing critiques. But I find it perplexing that in your analysis of sharia in pre-modernity, there is no such gesture to provide specific historical examples that illustrate your argument, not about the havoc that Orientalism brought on sharia, but about how pre-modern sharia exhibited this sublime marriage between fact and value. In other words, what I'm asking is, what specifically do you find suspect about history as a discipline? Why not move from the paradigmatic to the historic in order to illustrate your argument? If history is as suspect as anthropology or economics or business administration, how specifically is it at fault? I ask this question in order to pose another critical one, this time not about the method but the substance of the argument. For it seems to me that the paradigm of modern sharia posited in this book, as well as in your two earlier books, The Impossible State and Sharia, is a distinctly fiqhi Sufi paradigm, in the sense that it is difficult to locate it except in the minds of the fuqaha and the mutasawwifa. the jurists and the Sufis who produced the copious fiqh and Sufi manuals. It is not, I'm positive, it is not that this paradigm is a mythical one. I'm not saying that you are nostalgic about this period. I understand the argument about paradigm. Rather, I believe that the world you are painting is a conceptual world, one that is constructed in the minds of jurists and Sufis and may or may not bear a resemblance to the messy realities that Muslims live outside the neat pages of the fuqaha's elegant tomes. In making this observation, I'm referring specifically to the recent scholarship on siyasa judgment that has been studied by Yusuf Rappaport on Mamluk times, by Bashar Touf on 17th century Ottoman Empire, and by James Baldwin on 18th century Egypt. I should also refer to my own work on the records of siyasa in 19th century Egypt. This scholarship points to the possibility that the world depicted by the fuqaha in their elegant tomes, where fact and value may indeed be happily married, was indeed a limited world. This world of the fuqaha was limited not only in the sense that it did not reflect the reality out there, but that it was not the only benchmark, to use your own word, against which this world was to be measured. For in addition to the fiqh, siyasa, that is state law, state power, raison d'etat, was also a constituent part of sharia. Codification, which is described in your book as, quote, the result of European Orientalist translation, and which was antithetical to the makeup and structure of the sharia, unquote, was something that many Islamic states, most famously the Ottomans with their qanunnames, practiced as a matter of course. And recently, archival research in Istanbul and Cairo has shown that apart from codification, the Qadi court was but one of many legal bodies with overlapping jurisdictions. Mazalim courts, siyasa councils, and the Ottoman Divan were all examples of implementing siyasa as the prime tool of applying public law, which cannot be dismissed as tangential, given that it covered such central aspects of daily and political life as land law, taxes, and criminal law, among many others. Crucially, siyasa was not characterized by a happy marriage of fact and value, but by its exact opposite, namely by divorcing law from morality and marrying it instead to state prerogatives. So my question is, what happens to our understanding of sharia if we move out of the elegant tomes of the jurists and the Sufis and incorporate siyasa with its attendant reliance on state violence in it? How would our critique of modernity's onslaught be altered as a result?
Well, thank you so much for wonderful sets of questions. Very probing, difficult to answer all, and at times are slightly irrelevant to the concerns of the book, but relevant to your scholarship and my scholarship outside of this book. So to make distinctions and to save on time, I would like to first address the idea of agency, which is the main point that was raised by Sarah. I make in the book a clear distinction about the connection between agency and being a member or partaking in the system of power. In other words, if you enter the system of power, you begin to acquire agency even if you are colonized. I should not be mistaken about this or misunderstood about this point. What I am talking about is not what happened after modernity settled on the ground, meaning colonialism. I, by the way, do not buy into colonial modernity. Modernity for me is colonialism, and colonialism is modernity. Colonial modernity, to me, if I were to accept it, it only means that when we speak in a certain moment or time, we speak about the colonial aspect of modernity. But if we want to talk about it structurally, and this is my business really, I like structures. I like to look at how things work as a whole. I would say that modernity is always colonialist. As I also have written just recently in an interview, I don't think anyone consulted us, brown men and women, whether we want to be to adopt anything that Europe introduced to us. I asked my Indian colleague, Shodipta Kaviraj, about, because he keeps telling me that in fact Indians had some sort of agency, and they took even British knowledge and readapted into their, but he himself admits at the end of the day, as a footnote shows here, admits at the end of the day that in fact it is not the traditional knowledge that existed. Once the water was polluted, it was never, no one could clear it. The agency of all the ethnographic work you nicely told us about comes first after the fact and within the system of modernity. So yes, there are cracks in modernity. This is what I'm banking on in order for us to save our souls and bodies, actually, from modernity, is the cracks. Ecuador is really one of those cracks, but you admitted yourself that it is actually, it has been not been able to withstand the extraction. This is your language. I also argue in the end of the impossible state, precisely this point, that in fact, even with the rise of a certain locale of resistance, somehow somebody, especially the United States, will find a way to crush that resistance. It is destroying one country after another. Not that they are doing what I want them to do, but if they are able to destroy one country after in seriatim, they will destroy any of these attempts because simply they run against the corporation. So there is no agency even today, in my opinion, that much. You resist, but you get hit on the head, to put it in simple terms. But the beginning of colonialism did not give a chance, as a matter of method, did not give a chance to any form of agency to arise. And the proof of it is what happened. The history itself is the proof of the total lack of agency, is that all the world now is modernized. And whatever is left in the corners of mountains and villages and remote islands is getting modernized slowly. And you can see that by the way, with their not just poverty, but also the Coca-Cola bottles, empty plastic bottles, this is all you see in these islands. And simply a shirt that says, I love New York. And these people don't even have any modern facility yet. But they are still modern to some extent. Khalid's questions are, I might say, lovingly exorbitant, because they go beyond the realm of the book. I'm not interested. You raise questions about siyasa sharia that I am dealing with now in my graduate seminars. I have been for 2-3 years teaching precisely these texts that deal with the subject in order to try to map out the constitutional picture that Islam adopted before the 18th century. So we have, from your questions alone, I realize how much in common our projects are in, at least, but not about, restating Orientalism has a different concern. So let me address this first, and if we have time, I can get to the problems of. You ask about the nature of pre-modern power. And of course you tie it later because you object to my characterization of it as being innocent of the relationship that exists in modernity. You attribute my reading of that history to my indulgence in text. Now I would object to this vehemently. When I construct a structure, what I call central paradigms about pre-modern Islam, I don't rely on the reading on the fiqh works and the Sufi texts alone. In fact, what I would like always do is connect the text with the facts on the ground that no one disputes. For example, no one disputes that 60% in the Ottoman and North African grounds, 60% of real property was dedicated as waqf. The project of charity in the Muslim civilization is something that is so astounding, and no one has really made yet of it what it should be made of. It is a fact of tremendous importance. We look at how the court functions, generally from several locations. We look at, for example, how the Muslim city constructed itself. We look at what it means for Sufism to arise in Islam and gain grounds after the 9th, 10th centuries to such an extent that it becomes a major force, even overwhelming the sharia. Not in the sense of replacing it, but overwhelming it from the top and covering it, and in fact melting in it, so to speak, infusing itself in it to such an extent that it is at one point after the 11th, 12th centuries, you rarely can separate the sharia from Sufism. This is not just a textual thing. The text always speaks reality. Texts come always from the ground. Even the craziest Dali picture it has a certain reality. Dali is not just crazy not to imagine things from his dreams. There is something in modernity that produces Dali. This is to take an extreme example. The fiqh works, the legal works, are not like Dali. They are far closer to the reality than they are. In fact, they speak reality. The other thing, which when one says Sufism, now accepting that the Sharia and Sufism are what I call two central domains of Islam. They are the two giants that basically affected so much of the Islamic civilization for 12 centuries until colonialism. Sufism is not a textbook. Actually, Sufism is little textbooks and much practice on the ground. Every place you went to, from the village to the city, it was really organized around Sufi Shari ideas. The Sufis were there, the mercantile, the economy, the market, the social organization, everything in the city was colored by the Sufi brotherhoods as social groupings. So when I take these two as I take the major facts in the civilization that I don't know anybody who would doubt the presence of these issues. The scholarship takes it for granted. Now, about the brutality and tyranny of the executive power in Islam, that has another issue. This is why I'm interested in it for my seminars. And I think there is already a problem with this characterization. I'm not saying that they were not brutal sometimes. All pre-modern societies, like modern societies, when the executive operated, it was always brutal. That's not an issue. The issue is in what was the constitutional assignment of the executive. In other words, in order to write Islamic legal history, history of state or government, we must first chart the constitutional terrains of Islam. There isn't a single book so far on the constitutionality of Islam. Interesting, isn't it? After 150 years of Orientalist scholarship, not a single person cared to write one book about how did Muslims govern themselves in terms of constitutions. Here we have constitutional lawyers and philosophers and constitutionalists, or theorists. We have in the hundreds, if not thousands. But now let me go back to the book and the concerns of the book. I think just knowing Foucault alone, without knowing anything else about Islam, I can answer your question. Even if I were not an Islamicist at all, never studied Islam, after Foucault diagnosed a particular system of power and knowledge, a particular understanding of biopower and biopolitics, that meant something. It meant a particular government that is not to be separated from the social order. It's a society that cannot be separated from the ruler. there is no ruler in the first place in his system. In fact, as he said very theatrically, but very, very tellingly, there is no king to have his head cut off in this model. And where does he put this historically? Where does he locate it historically? In the 17th century, like everyone who studies modernity, the 17th century is the first century where you begin to have these distinctive modern features. He puts it 17th, 18th century with the full maturation of it in the 19th. Actually, his project in many ways ends with the end of the 19th century, if you want to read him holistically, so to speak. So what that means that Foucault already is telling us, well, I know nothing about Islam. And he didn't say this, I'm saying he could have said, I know nothing about Islam, but I can tell you that what I am describing didn't exist before. This is why, because I imagine Foucault to have said this. I always say, anyone who takes Foucault to analyze the pre-modern Islamic tradition is bordering on madness. Because actually there is nothing in Foucault to justify, if you know the first thing about how Muslims govern themselves, to justify, there's no picture equivalent. There was the Sultan, the Caliph was always outside of the, of what I call the civic order. Never penetrated it. There was taxation, of course, sending tax farmers and sometimes the judges, sharia judges themselves would go collect the taxes and impose public order. You know, not that it didn't exist, but when things get out of hand, people get selling too much wine and getting drunk in the streets, people complain, and then the Sultan cracks down on them. That is the extent of no one organized the civil order. There was no state to legislate family law or divorce law or any law, in fact, that pertains to the civic order. The civic order was legislated for and applied, meaning the law was enforced by the jurists themselves who were part of the civic order. So there is no state to tell them every 5-10 years there is a new law for marriage and divorce. There's a new law for crime and even whatever finance. The family was not reconstituted continuously as we do nowadays in modernity, because the family was in fact the prime value. You not only that you do not reconstitute it, you try to preserve it. You try to preserve the community, in other words. All of this, the business of social engineering, which the modern state is the most professional at. All of this engineering, social engineering, never was the business of the Sultan or the executive power. It was the business of the jurists who were also kind of Sufis, or the Sufis who were jurists. Almost every jurist was a Sufi. Not every Sufi was a jurist, right? So where is the biopower and biopolitics that we can speak about here? So the idea that, sorry, I'm doing, I can stop now, all right.
No, it's not that. It's just that I want to let our audience have a